So hello and welcome, or welcome back to our Exchanges programme. We're so pleased to be joined by Jess Stillerman and Nicolas Poncet from Aileron, who will give us an overview of key net zero concepts, UK regulations for charities, and reflect on the actions being taken by charities to play their part, from sustainability strategies and ways of working to carbon reduction plans and impact reports. As always, there will be time at the end for a Q&A, so please do use the Q&A button for any questions you'd like to ask. And without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Jess and Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Katharina. So we're very pleased actually to be here today and speak to you about sustainability and carbon reduction. We've prepared a few slides that we'll use for the presentation. But before we do that, we'll do a quick introduction. So I'm Nicolas Poncet. I'm the CEO of Aileron, which I set up now almost 12 years ago. And all our work is really focused on sustainability and social impact. And Jess is here with me today. Jess, you want to say a few words before we run through the slide?
Hi everyone, I am Jess Stillerman. I have been at Aileron for about 4 years now, and historically come from a non-profit background, both in South Africa and the UK. But I will share my screen to kick us off. Give me 1 sec. Everyone see that? Okay, perfect.
So I won't spend much time telling you about our organizations, but as I said, we've been there for 12 years now. We do a lot of work across the charity sectors, but not only. And as you can see from some of the logos, we've been very active in the UK, also some number of organizations in Europe and the US. Now, yeah, if we go maybe to the next slide, Jess, there are 4 things that we typically work on. We work on strategies, help organizations to better understand the market in which they operate, and support them in their organization strategy, sustainability strategy, carbon reduction. We then support them with their transformation, whether it is an operating model or changing their ways of working, which then lead to looking at the way they report and do the evaluation of their programs. And with a number of clients, we help them also with their sustainable investment, whether they are investors or they are seeking actually to receive investment. So these are the 4 areas where we typically are involved. Again, with many organizations are non-profit, but also some corporate or some public sector organizations. Now, if we move to the next slide and talk about today, so we're very pleased to be here and talk about sustainability and in particular net zero. We all know that it's really important. It's important for the long-term vision and mission of an organization. It raises actually going through that process for any organization helps to really think about how you operate. We know that looking at the sustainability also leads to thinking about your waste, thinking about your ways of working, thinking about your travel, thinking about how you can influence the organization that you work with, and ultimately help you to address the cause that you're supporting. So there is a lot of reasons, and we dig more into that for why environmental and sustainability is really important to any of you. Now, what we would like to cover, as Katharina said, is really to give you a quick overview of the UK context and the regulations, which is relevant to charities and non-profit. We'll give you a quick overview around that and how you can determine it actually based on your size, etc. You should be communicating specific information. Number 2, we look at the concept of net zero. What does it mean in practice? And then number 3, we'll go more into some actions that charities may have undertaken to really address net zero. And Jess will share a bit more some of the way to think about it so that you have a clear starting point. And then we'll end up with a Q&A. So that's what's on the menu for this afternoon. Now, if we if we continue, I think we wanted to do a little poll also. Should we do that now? Just to get a better sense actually on your familiarity with net zero. So before we start, we just wanted to actually understand, as you can see, if you're familiar with that concept, and then we'll good. I will give a few seconds still to answer. And why you're still answering? I think we all know the context around net zero and why it's important, all the different agreements which want to limit the. I think we good actually on the poll. So as you can see, a lot of people are on somewhat. Not many of you actually are not that familiar. But there's still quite a lot of work to do to actually get everybody on the same page. So 52% somewhat, 36 yes, and 12 no, as you can see. Now, if I'm just going to remove it. So global warming is there. We know we need to do something to reduce global warming, and that's why we have these targets. Initially on reducing globally by 50% the CO2 emissions, equivalent emissions by 2030, but importantly get to net zero by 2050. And that means a lot of changes to our way of working without damaging other things. And what we've seen is that actually with charities, so we published a year ago actually a report on the sustainability of UK charities, which you can download from our website. And what was striking is that a number of organizations actually did not really care that much about their sustainability at the time, only with the really large one, because of course, as a charitable organization, a non-profit, you would have your own mission, which is really important, and sometimes the environment was not necessarily as part of that mission. But increasingly, donors are asking if you provide services. Also, most whether it is a government or the supplier or the customers, we want to understand actually what are your credentials, what you're doing for the environment. Your employees will be asking, the volunteers will be asking. So all the landscape is completely changing, so that actually it's very difficult to operate now without having requests from stakeholders around what is your sustainability or carbon reduction plans. So with that in mind, let's look a bit more at the regulatory landscape to really understand that. But before I do that, I will just spend a few seconds on the importance of charities in the sector, which is quite significant, as you all know, because if the UK has committed to 78% reduction in national emission by 2035, the charities are represented quite an important economic value, about 200 billion, and they represent quite a big part of the workforce. And when we think about the importance of travel, the importance of commuting, it's non-negligible. And we know that a lot of the largest charities also will definitely have an impact in their purchasing power. And that's why a number of the government regulations, which are mentioned here, the SECR, so the Streamline Energy and Carbon Regulation, as well as ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Schemes, are there to make sure that charities also play their role. So now, if I tell you a bit more about this, the approach to sustainability, I think what we saw is that there are a number of things that, of course, are important for charities, the regulation side, but there are also benefits in really looking at the way you operate, so that you can reduce waste, you can improve your operating costs, you can actually bring the teams a bit more together. I had many discussions with charities saying, well, actually, COVID helped us to break down some silos that we had because the office was done in such a way that we did not work very well together. So there are a lot of things that's actually looking at your sustainability can achieve, because you will change your way of operating and redefine what it is to come to the office, to work collaboratively, etc. We talked about the stakeholders, so I won't say more about that. And we also mentioned the importance for the long-term mission of the organization, because you bring where the sustainability as part of your impact and what you try to achieve, as well as being mindful of what could be the impact of the environment, what could be the impact of other factors into the cause that you support. And in many cases, there is indeed an impact. We've been working with some organizations operating in social sectors, and whether it is about inequality, whether it is about preventing flooding, etc. Of course, the environment play a key role, and understanding the risk and having a strategy against that is really important. Now, we also sharing with you, and some of the slides will be shared, some of the Charity Commission survey, which was that slide just before, Jess, around the importance of the, as you can see, the most important factor when it comes to the way charity operates, and the ethical standards, the impact, etc., are really important beyond just the money. So now let's spend a bit of time just on the regulation, which was the slide that just put on. So when you look at the numbers, you may say, well, you may not be in that category, but if you look at that, there are three main regulations which are important. The last one, the environmental and community impact, is there for everybody, and that's about the role of directors required to act in a way that considers the impact of the company's operation on the community and the environment. And Jess, we speak to us afterwards about one way to be able to assess that through a materiality analysis. But that's really an important element around the role of your directors and your trustees in making sure that they respect that. Now, the other two regulations here, as you can see, are applicable above a certain threshold. So, as you can see, there are a few factors. There is a headcount, the turnover, and your balance sheets. So it's not cumulative that if you're above a certain threshold in one, you have to comply with that regulation. And that's regulation. So the first one, the SECA regulations, means that you need to report and monitor your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then the scope 3 for some of the elements which are part of your boundaries, as well as your energy usage. So you will communicate that into your reports. The next one, which is ESOS, is all about your energy reduction, and that's where you need to report on where do you use the most electricity or most energy, and be able to identify clear targets for reduction. So this one is very specific to the energy, and is applicable to sort of larger organization typically. Now, although you may not be in that category where it's mandatory for you to report it, you may choose to do it, like more and more organizations, because it becomes really important to your stakeholders. If you bid, for example, also on public sector contracts, for contracts which are worth more than 5 million, then you will have to publish a carbon reduction plan, for example, and the carbon reduction plan, which we talk a bit later, will provide information about your current carbon emission data, your baseline, your targets, and how you think you will achieve the targets. Maybe let's let's go to the next slide. So now what we'll do is that I will hand over to Jess, who will tell us a bit more about net zero and go through the details, and then we carry on going through really practical steps about how to measure net zero and find ways to reduce your carbon emissions. Jess, did we want to do a survey now again?
Yes, we sure do. Hi, everyone. So we are going to do a quick poll too, just to get a sense of your understanding with the topic of net zero when it comes to your organization. So rather than your familiarity, but rather how it feels to your organization itself. So I'm just going to quickly launch that for you and give you a few seconds to respond to that one. We're almost there. Very active audience. Thank you very much. All right, just give you one more sec. Cool. So when we're thinking about your audience and your particular organization and their engagement with net zero, it's clear that almost half of you feel that it's an important topic, and I think we'll discover to what extent and what actions being taken a little bit later. But it's at least somewhat or definitively important to the majority of the organizations here. And perhaps we can dig into it a little bit later in terms of why it isn't important. For others, it may not be a priority for some, but eventually may become a requirement to a certain extent, even if it isn't front and center of your mind right now. But we can start to dig into those in a little bit. So maybe if I just close this poll. And give you, I know that we've been speaking a little bit about regulations and the context and why you should care if you don't care, but maybe if we just give you a quick introduction, just make sure that we're all on the same page about some of the terminology that we use and the concepts that we're throwing around today before we dig into the actions specifically. So net zero, what it really means, is that balance of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere balanced with those being removed from the atmosphere, right? That's the net that we're really talking about. And the net is important because it's difficult to reduce all your emissions down to zero, but we really want the balance and the result of all of that to be zero. So it might mean that you need to remove and reduce wherever you're able to, but it could also mean that you need to offset to some extent. And offsetting is, it's a controversial topic in some instances, but broadly what it means is that where you aren't able to reduce your emissions, you do something else that helps to balance out that impact on it. So there are a number of different mechanisms that you can do, and we can talk about that another time. But they're quite everything from planting a tree somewhere to taking active steps in other spaces. But really, what you want is that balance and the result of your work to be net zero, and reduction being the first ambition. And wherever you're unable to do that, then we offset. And then we talk about net zero targets, and as Nicholas was referring to, they're national objectives for net zero, and consequently there are things that organizations in the UK need to do in order to aid that ambition, and really come in line with the national objectives and global ones for that matter. And so part of that is reaching net zero by 2050 at a national level, but at a global level, sorry. And but organizations are constantly setting their own net zero ambitions. So targeting a particular time for when they will reach this net zero. And again, it's that moment when you've balanced out and reduced as much as possible, but offset to wherever required. So that's broadly the terms that we're talking about when we're throwing around words like net zero. But in terms of the very specific terminology as well, and you may well be familiar with some of these things, but just for a leveling of some of the terminology, we consider emissions across a full value chain. And when we say value chain, we're saying that everything that you do in the life cycle of your organization, so that's your upstream activities, that's things like your supply chain, and where you're getting materials from or support or whatever it is that you're bringing in to your organization, everything that you do to that along the way. So if you're given the audience, you're not necessarily producing something and changing material into something else, but you are providing something and operationalizing something. And then it's a distribution. So it's really everything from your supply all the way down to your consumers or your service users or whatever is at the other end of your process. So we're considering emissions across the full spread of your value chain, but we consider them, and when we say we mean us and everyone else who's considering emissions across the world right now. It is both your direct and your indirect emissions. So when we talk about direct emissions, those are emissions when you control the source and you own and are able to control that source of the emissions specifically. The indirect is things that you utilize, either supply or there's emissions as a consequence of your use of something that is controlled by another party or another organization. And then so those are kind of two ways to cut it, the direct and indirect. And then when you hear the words scope 1, 2, and 3 getting thrown around fairly regularly, then we're talking about scope 1 being those direct emissions that we just described, those owned and controlled. And scope 2 and 3 are both indirect. Scope 2 is about emissions specifically being generated from purchased or acquired electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. So those kind of utilities in that kind of way, the powering of your operations, but very, very specifically about that. And then scope 3 is really everything else that's indirect in your emissions that you don't capture in scope 2 in that specific category. And so here there are 15 broadly accepted categories for those scope 3. And that will include everything from your purchased goods and services in your supply chain, all the way to your business travel, to meetings and things like that, to your commuting. So how do your employees get to work, etc. So everything really the light touches in terms of emissions that falls outside of that scope 2 indirect emission that we consider. So that's what we're talking about when we're throwing around a lot of these words, and in reference to the regulations that Nicholas was talking about. The scope 1 and 2 is usually categorized as the mandatory disclosure focus of reporting, but more and more scope 3, and specifically for organizations where scope 3 is the bulk of your emissions, then you really want to be considering scope 3 as well. And with regulations constantly changing, organizations are broadly but pragmatically reviewing their full value chain to try and understand where their emissions are, and then reporting on all three. But at the moment, scope 1 and 2 is really the from a regulatory perspective where you have to focus. So just a quick introduction to some of the protocols and processes. So there are accepted systems in place and protocols and guidance on how to measure these scopes that we're talking about, what to measure. And so I just spoke about those regulations really capturing scope 1 and 2 as a requirement, and organizations being more flexible when it comes to scope 3. But a leading guideline on your protocols and how to measure this is the greenhouse gas protocol, so GHG protocol. You might have seen it. There are lots and lots of documents and templates out there explaining the technical minutiae of how to measure certain elements, but ultimately it is the corporate standard is the very, very basic one that we look to help organizations through, and that helps you understand both your risks and opportunities when it comes to reaching net zero and scoping out your emission impact. You really want to understand those hotspot areas across your value chain of emissions so that you can reduce them or actively offset them. But you also want to spot opportunities for new ways of working that could both reduce your emissions, but also potentially position you in a place that you offer a new service, you offer something else that helps to tackle these things proactively. So it's not just about your emissions, but it opens up new opportunities in a space that you may not have considered. So as part of that process and the carbon reduction plan that we were talking about a little bit earlier, it's one of those key ways that you start to scope these out and map out your plan to net zero. But as a first step, GHG protocol helps you understand what they call the emissions inventory, which is really looking across your value chain, assessing your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then enabling organizations to be able to, we call it screen your scopes to understand where they are having the greatest impact along the way, and being a little bit more pragmatic about capturing the things that really have substantial impact on your own organization. But I think that's a sufficient intro to some of the processes and protocols, and there are many organizations that are working through it. CDP talks about disclosure, and the government's requiring particular disclosure at the moment. So it's a shifting context, but ultimately the insight is consistent, which is understand your impact as best you possibly can, and work in line with the science and with the changing insights that are coming along in the space. So when we are thinking about measuring it in practice, like what does this actually mean for you? You've just heard a lot of information that is regulatory. It's dry. These are all the scopes that are happening. Like, what does this actually mean for me as an organization? I think part of what we want to understand is where you're at currently. So we might, I think now is probably a good time to launch a third poll. And so we're just trying to get an understanding of your organization and what situation best describes you as an organization. So I'll launch this one if I haven't lost you, that you're fairly engaged. It's like watching two horses kind of compete for first place here as you watch the balls come in, but Very interesting. All right, let's give you another 10 seconds. Okay, cool. So the three situations are, one is that you're not planning on setting a net zero target. The other is that you have already set, or you're planning on setting a net zero target, but you don't yet have a plan in place, an action plan in place. And the third being, you're planning on setting a target and you have the clear action plan in place. So I think we've got a very low percentage, one organization representing that clear action plan already in place. And having said it, it looks like just over half are planning to set a net zero target but don't yet have that action plan in place. And just under half not planning on setting a net zero target. Now, we can maybe engage on the chat or something like that as well to really understand why you're not planning on setting a net zero target. Is it that it just isn't a priority yet? Is it that it's not a requirement and therefore you're not engaging on that, or you haven't really thought about it until now? I'm sure there are many other options for why you haven't or don't intend to do that right now, but it'll be interesting to know what those motivators are. But if we start to think about some of what it means in practice to really start to engage in these spaces, some of it is about an action plan, and it's certainly a good place to start. But when it comes to communicating about net zero, that's part of the key milestones to hit is engaging in your public spaces, engaging in your website, taking a position on things. And I know that for many organizations, we see that taking a position is sometimes the hardest part because they're nervous to commit to a particular year. They're not sure. We can only know so much at this point. But ultimately, most organizations that start to engage more deeply in their value chain and really just understanding their own impact feel that committing to an ambition, you can change it, you can update it as and when new information comes about, but you really do need to start to consider your strategy towards that. So set an ambition and then update it when and how whenever you have more information at hand. But very, very quickly, if you're not already obligated to comply with certain regulations, you will be soon. There will be some degree of regulatory impetus over here. The first step is to start to weave in sustainability and net zero into your everyday operational strategies. When you really start to deeply assess how you can change, you'll need to consider it at every level of your operations, but just bringing it to your organizational strategy level and setting targets at that broad level sets a tone for the rest of the organization, makes it a priority, and you'll start to engage with it in that kind of way. We can talk more broadly in a little bit later about what those really, really clear practical steps are, but what we want to say is that compliance is going to become more and more of an issue or a guider. Strategy and targets are going to be a requirement in order to comply and actually direct you. And then you want to measure and monitor against these targets to make sure that you're actually progressing, and iterate off the back of it as you would in any kind of impact or performance monitoring. Really understand where and how you're doing along the way. And then lastly, as part of the compliance, but also relevant for your stakeholders more and more, for your funders, for your supporters, for volunteers, and for your staff asking for this kind of for these positions and improvements, reporting and communicating. And those can be formal reports, but it's also internal reporting, decision making, and general kind of impact that you're having as an organization. So we start to think a little bit more practically about those steps that you can take within your strategy. As we were talking about, it's about actually just having a strategy, having a sustainability strategy or policy, taking a position on this, and what the organization is going to be doing about delivering and prioritizing this as a key issue. It will matter who your stakeholders are. So outlining exactly who your stakeholders are and what matters to them. Different audiences will want to understand different things about your sustainability and your ambitions within it. And just setting that clear ambition in line with probably your others in your space, other organizations either engaging in the same area or the sector itself. And it could be because you specialize in a particular nonprofit space, your other organizations are setting a target, and therefore you must. You could be competing for supporters, and this becomes a key issue for them in terms of their investment, etc. So really starting to think about what your strategy is to tackle this and engage in it responsibly. And then, as we were talking about it, then measuring and managing it. So really actually responding to how well you're doing and the progress. There are many mechanisms that are nonprofits are using, everything from your systems in place and your actual processes to measure and monitor it, your impact, to scoping these scope 1, 2, and 3 across your value chain. Really just understanding what your value chain even is. So mapping it out, finding out where those key activities are that have emissions and the intensity of them, including up at the top of your value chain when it comes to your suppliers, what are your procurement processes, etc. And so we can work through all of those, and then finally in those in the communicating and reporting, making sure that they're accessible and verifiable points of information. So organizations are already moving well through those places, but in many different places, you can see even in the poll of the group, understanding where you're at and wanting to set a target, but not yet knowing what their clear action plan is. You and a lot of other organizations across the UK for sure. So maybe just as a quick introduction, Nicholas was talking about this a little bit earlier, and then we'll just give time for Q&A. There are two things that we referenced today. One is a materiality assessment, and we won't spend too long on this. We can circulate the deck afterwards, but this is to do with really finding out what matters to your stakeholders and the business. So really understanding your organization and the key issues that matter to you, and as well as the key issues that matter to all your stakeholders, both your internal and external stakeholders. So a key first step is doing a materiality assessment, and this is important across all ESG factors when it comes to organizations. But you really want to start to plot the importance of these so that you can focus your attention and spend the energy in the areas that matter to you as an organization and to your key audiences. And then the next one, which I'll just spend a second on, because Nicholas spoke about it a little bit earlier, is a carbon reduction plan. So your plan in place to reduce your carbon emission. This is, we know now, is already a requirement when it comes to organizations bidding for public funding. And so you can see that more and more it's becoming a requirement for organizations to actually understand their emissions and detail out plans to reduce it. And so creating a carbon reduction plan is a requirement for some already, but ultimately a very good place for others to start when they start on their own journey towards net zero. But I will stop there and give time for questions for anyone think there is some chat going on as well. So I don't know if, okay, I can see the chat. And I'll invite Nicholas as well to, I don't know if you can see that as well, but I'll just read it out for everyone. So do you think the journey to net zero suffers because the main messaging is around compliance legislation and regulation rather than highlighting the positive of making change? I think that both are important. I think that you sometimes you need the incentive of regulatory requirement to drive action because it catalyzes change in that regard. But I think that when it comes to really landing a message and people caring about it and therefore driving an ambition genuinely, then you want to understand how that can positively change the way that you work. It can impact positively on your work, for your beneficiaries, for the sustainability financially of your organization, the opportunities where you can reframe things to be to better your organization and the impact of your organization. Yes, I think that's generally more powerful, but I think that the regulation allows you, maybe drives the urgency to actually address those questions. That's my first reaction to that, but Nicholas might have some other thoughts on that.
I agree, and I think we've seen actually more and more organizations talking about what they're doing, some of their initiatives, from simple things around changing the their electricity bulb to changing their travel policy to. And I think the more people talk about it, also the more they talk about the compliance. Compliance is good at the beginning, but all these stories are helping to identify opportunities, not just ultimately to reduce carbon emission, but also to work better as an organization and more collaboratively. And that's the example I gave earlier about the reduction of travel and maybe working remotely. Has helped some actually to reduce some silos in the organization and work better between departments. So there are always going to be some benefits, and the more we share them, the easier it is to implement those solutions internally.
Maybe just to flag to Kat that we can't see the Q&A.
Okay, got it. We have a couple of Q&As now. So we'll start with Stuart says, I guess we're just unsure where to start. How do we begin to calculate our present emissions / carbon footprint?
Nicholas, do you want to start it off?
Yeah, well, I think if just on the carbon footprint, the start, as Jess explained, traditionally people look at the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And the starting point is really to define what are your boundaries. So what are the things that really you believe you should be measuring as an organization, and that's relatively easy for your scope 1 and 2 because it's more about your own consumption of fuel, of energy within your own buildings. But then it comes a bit different when you look at the scope 3 and understanding actually, depending on what you do, how far do you want to go in terms of understanding your employee committing, understanding actually how you're working with your beneficiaries or your volunteers. So there are a number of dimensions to think of and defining that boundaries. But once you've done that, then scope 1 or 2 are not very difficult to measure because it's very much about your usage of product, whether it is fuel or electricity, and in most cases you should be able to access that data. It gets slightly more complicated, but there are a lot of methodologies out there to look at your scope 3 emissions, and we'd be very happy to share some of that to whomever is interested.
Great. I hope that answered your question, Stuart. We've got another one. It says, if you are a UK registered charity, but the majority of your activity happens outside of the UK, how much do you need to review / report on all activity?
I can start with it. I think it's part of the same point around the boundaries. I think there is, because the regulation is more related to your own operations in the UK. Having said that, from a boundaries perspective, you may want to report on all your activities internationally, because it makes sense for you to do so. And in that case, yeah, I would encourage you to look at that footprint everywhere. Where it starts to become complicated is in carbon emission. You will need factors, emission factors from therefore different countries, because the emissions related to your energy consumption in the UK will be different to the energy consumption or production in another country. So it's slightly more complex because you need more data points, but it's often the right thing to do.
That's great. And we have another one that says from Gareth again, saying, what do you think is the best way of encouraging your suppliers to help reduce your indirect emissions? Sharing expectations with suppliers, maybe? Yeah,
I think a lot of organizations work with suppliers. And of course, it depends how big you are and how big they are in terms of your influence on them. But that dialogue is important. And it starts with transparency of information. Some organizations will be relatively transparent in terms of their carbon emissions and what's driving carbon emissions and what you should be using. Others will be less, but the dialogue is the best way. And I think more and more suppliers expect actually now to have that discussion and to communicate. And you have many initiatives. You know, we're working on one in the education sector and technology in education, where some of the organizations there really want to be able to communicate the carbon reduction related to the usage of data. And the more data you use, the more carbon emission. But all these, sector by sector initiatives are there to support that dialogue with suppliers. I don't know, Jess, did you want to add something?
Yeah, the only thing to add, I think, is just to Nicholas's point on influence. So the action that you take off the back of that might mean that once you have this insight into your suppliers' impact and therefore your own, what can you do about it? So if you're big and you can influence the way that your supplier supplies and say that we will no longer procure from you because you don't meet certain standards, that might be in the same messaging that they're hearing from a lot of consumers, that there is a drive, just like there's a drive for you from your stakeholders, there's a drive from them for them to change their ways of working. You might not have that influence over some of your suppliers given your size, but you may well have the power to shift to another supplier. So just to reduce your own emissions as well. So sometimes there are different levers that you can pull. Some have more widespread impacts on the sector, like changing the way a supplier actually supplies, but others may just change your own consuming habits as well. So just think about the kind of, you can do both as well.
That's a really good answer. And just looking at the chat, there's a general question sort of more aimed at ethical property, but I think it kind of also, you kind of answered that in that question, sort of saying, I guess it's up to us to, the question basically just outlines sort of like suppliers or tenants having a net zero plan going forward, but it's kind of up to us to kind of have that influence and that say. So it's definitely something for our company and the company I'm in to think about whether we have that as a criteria. But we've had Liana in the chat also saying interested about hearing more about methodologies for Scope 3. If you want to.
Yes, I think it would take a bit more time to go through each categories, but as Jess said, there are 15 categories that typically one will look at in terms of Scope 3 emissions, but they are very different in nature. They are.
I think she's letting you off the hook here and saying that it's for after the meeting. But
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we can
Absolutely.
definitely discuss any of those methodologies, hopefully go into detail how it really works for you as well.
We'll forward that on to you, Liana. Thank you. Just to save a bit of time, but she has asked a question in the Q&A. So she says, oh, sorry, Misha's asked one. Sorry, we'll jump back to you, Liana, in a sec. Misha's asked a general question. She's read a lot of local authority carbon plans where they aim to offset their emissions through tree planting. Obviously, there is a limit to this. What happens when we collectively run out of opportunities to sequester?
There are, of course, the tree are a limitation, and they're not always the best thing. There are actually solutions actually to optimize which sort of tree you should plant where, which could be useful for large landowners. But there are many other solutions also to capture carbon in what you do. So I think the offsetting carbon capture that we talked about, as Jess said, is the last resort. But the capture of carbon through different type of technologies now is also possible, not just planting trees. But the focus is really to start with on reducing everything you can to then limit that. And it might be that you can't really at some point go down, reduce, and you need to buy carbon credit, etc. But you could also, some organization invest in farmers, and so you don't need to do the tree planting necessarily. There are many other options which are open to anyone, but it would cost some money. I think that's the only thing at the end.
Great, thank you so much. And Liana has another question and just says, are you aware of any networks where charities are sharing successes that they've had? Essentially, what has had significant impact for them?
There is a network which we circulate around the sustainability in charity, which now the name is escaping me, but I will circulate afterwards. And there are not that many story sharing. I think a lot of the network has been more focused on sharing some regulation or activities, but the sort of success stories are limited. In the report that we have, we share some of them, and we actually do another report this year. So we try to share more and more stories going forward. So if you have some good stories also that you want to share, I'm very happy to hear them and communicate them. But we'll also make sure that we do that.
Amazing. And actually that might be a very good idea for Ethical Property to even take on and see if there can be a forum kind of created if people are interested or tenants are interested in creating a little sort of community sharing their sort of their journey along to net zero. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, there's someone in chat saying in Manchester they have the Greater Manchester Arts Sustainability Team, and they aim to share thinking and best practice. So yeah, it sounds like there might be teams local to you. It might be worth doing a search and seeing if there's anything already set up by councils or any local charities near you. Or
so there are a few. So we've been working with Greater Manchester Authority and under the council in Oldham on their green strategy, because there is a big green strategy there. And they want to support the local economy. So there are a lot of initiatives which are really interesting there about regenerations, about pushing a number of industries to change local housing and make houses more efficient and reduce the carbon footprint related to housing. So there is a lot of things also from the college or universities trying to actually create a local workforce which is experienced in sustainability and carbon reduction. So I think it's definitely worth looking at the local initiatives. Yeah, Manchester is a great one because they have a very ambitious target.
A great example, yeah. No, and we'll do our best to try and share some groups relating to any cities that our tenants are in, see if we can share resources. So we'll definitely try and pass those on. But if there's no more questions, then I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much to Jess and Nicholas for their really informative talk today. It was really great to hear, and so much information that I think will be so useful to everyone. So thank you both. And we have our next event coming up soon in April, just as the spring sunshine is coming. It's going to be about the role of urban gardens in supporting pollinators. So that's on the 27th of April. So we hope to see you then, and take care. Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
very much. Bye.
Bye.